residential report writing and case studies. Chapter 2, reporting basics and options, page 1. Chapter overview. In Chapter 2, we will cover general USPAP requirements for appraisal reporting, including disclosure of extraordinary assumptions and hypothetical conditions. We will also address some of the pitfalls and shortcomings of commonly used residential appraisal report forms. Chapter 2, Learning Objectives. Upon completion of this chapter, participants will be able to identify the basic requirements for an appraisal report and a restricted appraisal report. Define assumptions, extraordinary assumptions, hypothetical conditions, and their corresponding reporting requirements. Identify the two reporting options from Standards Rule 2-2 and uses and applicability of each. Explain the differences between the two reporting options. Identify and articulate some pitfalls of using forms to report appraisals. End of page. Page 2, Chapter 2, Reporting Basics and Options. USPAP Basics. Standard 2 of USPAP establishes the minimum requirements for real property appraisal reports. As such, these requirements are a good starting point for a discussion of appraisal reporting. An appraiser may provide more information in the report than what is required by Standard 2. However, he or she may not include less. In this chapter, we will go through Standard 2 from beginning to end. While this is not intended to be a USPAP course, a thorough understanding of USPAP reporting requirements is essential for appraisers. In real-life appraisal practice, appraisers regularly need to make decisions about report content, how much information to include, what level of detail is sufficient, what to disclose, etc. Producing a USPAP compliant appraisal report is one of the best ways an appraiser can protect himself or herself against liability. Remember that these USPAP requirements are for report content. Content was in bold. USPAP does not dictate the form, format, or style of an appraisal report. USPAP does not instruct an appraiser when to use a form, what form to use, or when a form report cannot be used. These decisions are made by appraisers and clients. There are 4 standards rules in Standard 2. They are numbered 2-1, 2-2, 2-3, and 2-4. We will examine them in order. End of page. Chapter 2, Reporting Basics and Options, page 3. Standards Rule 2-1. Standards Rule 2-1 provides some basic foundational requirements for real property appraisal reporting. Each written or oral real property appraisal report must 1. Clearly and accurately set forth the appraisal in a manner that will not be misleading. 2. Contain sufficient information to enable the intended users of the appraisal to understand the report properly. And 3. Clearly and accurately disclose all assumptions, extraordinary assumptions, hypothetical conditions, and limiting conditions used in the assignment. It is worth noting that this standards rule applies to both written and oral real property appraisal reports. That was in bold. Once again, it is worth noting that this standards rule applies to both written and oral real property appraisal reports. 1. The Appraisal Foundation Uniform Standards of Professional Appraisal Practice, Washington, D.C. Appraisal Standards Board, 2020-2021, Edition, Standard 2, end of page. Page 4. What does SR 2-1 mean? Standards Rule 2-1A builds on the ethics rule requirement that our report must not be misleading. We can avoid being misleading in our appraisal reports by making sure that we clearly and accurately set forth the appraisal. Note, in this course, we will often abbreviate Standards Rule as SR. Standards Rule 2-1B states that we must provide our client and other intended users with enough information to understand the report. That requires us to communicate with clients on their level. Clients and intended users will require more or less information depending on many factors, including, but not limited to, their level of sophistication or experience with appraisals and appraisal reports, the intended use of the appraisal and report, relevant property characteristics, the complexity of the appraisal process, etc. Just as the scope of work varies from assignment to assignment, the level of required detail in a report also varies from different assignments. Standards Rule 2-1C states that we must clearly and accurately disclose all assumptions, extraordinary assumptions, hypothetical conditions, and limiting conditions used in the assignment. While we are probably very familiar with limiting conditions, such as those standard limiting conditions found in the various Fannie Mae forms, a brief review of assumptions, extraordinary assumptions, and hypothetical conditions would be beneficial at this point. Before that, though, there will be a short quiz. 1. The Appraisal Foundation Uniform Standards of Professional Appraisal Practice, Washington, D.C. Appraisal Standards Board, 20 through 2021, Edition, Standard 2, 2 IBIT, end of page. This quiz has a total of 3 questions. There will be 1 question per page. You must achieve 66% to pass this quiz. Start quiz. Number 1. Sandy is appraising an income property for a very knowledgeable client. Which statement is true regarding how much information Sandy must insert in her appraisal report? A. The client's level of knowledge does not matter. A report be worthless. B. Sandy should write the report to an 8th grade reading level. C. Sandy must ensure that her report cannot be understood by anyone. D. Because the client is knowledgeable, Sandy may put less information in the report. This is a hard one. I'm gonna just go on a wild guess. I'm gonna go D. Number 2. Standards Rule 2-1 states that assumptions, extraordinary assumptions, and hypothetical conditions must be A. Included in an addendum to the appraisal report. B. Clearly and accurately disclosed. C. Pre-printed on the report form. Or D. Agreed upon with the client prior to the assignment. I'm going to go B. Clearly and accurately disclosed. Number 3. When reporting, USPAP states that an appraiser must clearly and accurately set forth the appraisal in a manner that will not be misleading. True or false? I'm going true. I'll be damned. You scored 100%. I guess that was the answer for number 1. Because the client is knowledgeable, Sandy may put less information in the report. Good job. Chapter 2, Reporting Basics and Options, page 6, Assumptions. The definitions section of USPAP used to provide us with this definition. Assumption, that which is taken to be true. That definition was removed from the 2018-2019 edition of USPAP. The Appraisal Standards Board deleted this definition of assumption, as its use is not intended to differ from the general English meaning of the word. The board also adopted a revised definition of extraordinary assumption in an effort to clarify that term and its applicability. We will address that on the next page. Assumptions, sometimes called ordinary assumptions, are made in virtually every appraisal assignment. For instance, do you complete a title search on every property you appraise? You don't? So how do you know the property title is good and marketable? You assume it is so. The same goes for hidden conditions of the soil. Do you dig down in the backyard to make sure the soil and subsoil are stable and free of contaminants? Of course not. You just assume this is the case. According to Standards Rule 2-1C, even ordinary assumptions need to be disclosed. For example, I assume property title is good and marketable and will render no opinions about the quality of the title. I assume there are no hidden or unapparent conditions of the soil or subsoil that would render it more or less valuable. We will discuss assumptions in more detail later in this course. End of page. Page 7. Extraordinary assumptions. The revised definition of extraordinary assumption builds upon the definition of assumption, but they are different things. Extraordinary assumption, an assignment specific assumption as of the effective date, which, if found to be false, could alter the appraiser's opinions or conclusions. Comment. Uncertain information might include physical, legal, or economic characteristics of the subject property, or conditions external to the property, such as market conditions or trends, or the integrity of data used in an analysis. The first thing to acknowledge with regard to an extraordinary assumption is that it is something we do not know, but we take it to be true. Second, while an ordinary assumption may be made in virtually every appraisal assignment, an extraordinary assumption is directly related to a specific assignment. We acknowledge that if we find that the extraordinary assumption is actually not true, then our value opinion could be impacted or changed as a result. This is what makes it extraordinary, because it is directly relevant to our appraisal or value opinion. Therefore, SR, or Standards Rule 2-1C, requires that all extraordinary assumptions be disclosed clearly and accurately so that the intended users know that the value opinion depends upon the extraordinary assumption being true. An extraordinary assumption might be used, for instance, if we were to appraise a house with a small crack in the foundation. An appraiser is not expected to render an opinion about the structural integrity of the dwelling, and is generally not qualified to do so. Simply, we do not know if the dwelling is structurally sound. By implementing an extraordinary assumption that the dwelling is structurally sound, we can value the property without knowing or paying someone else to investigate whether the dwelling is indeed structurally sound. If we have a reasonable basis for this assumption, and if its use is necessary to develop a credible opinion of value, then we may utilize it in the appraisal process. If there is no reasonable basis for the extraordinary assumption, then it cannot be used to develop a credible appraisal. USPAP requires that we disclose the extraordinary assumption in the appraisal report. This disclosure gives notice to the client and intended users that our knowledge of the property only goes so far, and other information has been relied on, which, if found to be false, could have an impact on our value opinion. If this degree of risk is not acceptable, the client might prefer to engage an expert to perform additional investigation and analysis. When we disclose the use of the extraordinary assumption, we are also required to state that its use may have affected the assignment results. Failure to disclose the extraordinary assumption would be a significant omission in the appraisal report. Because the intended users could be misled regarding the appraiser's reliance upon information that is to some degree uncertain. 1. The Appraisal Foundation Uniform Standards of Professional Appraisal Practice, Washington, D.C. Appraisal Standard Board 2020 through 2021 edition. Definitions, end of page. Page 8. Hypothetical conditions. Now we will consider the hypothetical condition. Whereas we believe an extraordinary assumption to be true, a hypothetical condition is something that we know is not true, yet we appraise the property as though it were true. Hypothetical condition. A condition directly related to a specific assignment, which is contrary to what is known by the appraiser to exist on the effective date of the assignment results, but is used for the purpose of analysis. Comment. Hypothetical conditions are contrary to known facts about physical, legal, or economic characteristics of the subject property, or about conditions external to the property, such as market conditions or trends, or about the integrity of data used in an analysis. A good example of utilizing a hypothetical condition in the appraisal process is the appraisal of a property with proposed improvements. When the appraisal uses a current effective date, whenever we appraise a home that is not yet built, for instance, we know with full certainty that the improvements simply do not exist as of the effective date of the appraisal, and yet the appraised value of the property reflects the completed improvements. Typically and correctly, the appraiser will disclose that the appraised value is subject to completion per plans and specifications. This is good, but not good enough. Additional language is required to clearly disclose the hypothetical condition and state that its use might have affected the assignment results. For example, we might state in a report, the appraised value is subject to completion of the improvements per plans and specifications. based upon the hypothetical condition that the improvements were complete as of the effective date. The use of this hypothetical condition might have affected the assignment results. In this example, the USPAP requirement for a clear disclosure of the hypothetical condition is met. USPAP requires that a hypothetical condition be clearly and accurately disclosed, but does not specifically require that a hypothetical condition be labeled as a hypothetical condition. You are not required to use the exact words hypothetical condition in your report, although many appraisers believe that such labeling is a best practice. When the Fannie Mae 1004 form was revised in 2005, the following language was added on page 2 of the form, in the section which indicates the conditions of the appraisal as is or subject to completion per plans and specifications based on the hypothetical condition that the improvements have been completed. Emphasis added. 1. The Appraisal Foundation Uniform Standards of Professional Appraisal Practice, Washington, D.C., Appraisal Standards Board 2020 through 2021 edition. Definitions, end of page. Page 9. Disclosing assumptions and hypothetical conditions. Standards Rule 2-1 of USPAP states that disclosure of assumptions, extraordinary assumptions, and hypothetical conditions must be clear and accurate. For extraordinary assumptions and hypothetical conditions, Standards Rule 2-2 states their disclosure must also be clear and conspicuous. This additional requirement for disclosure of extraordinary assumptions and hypothetical conditions is further testament to the fact that if an extraordinary assumption or hypothetical condition is not conspicuously disclosed, the appraisal report could be significantly misleading to the client and intended users. Conspicuous means that the disclosure must be apparent to an intended user reading the report. For example, if an appraiser uses a hypothetical condition that a contaminated property is free of contamination, and then buries the disclosure of the hypothetical condition in the fine print at the bottom of page 25 of the report, this disclosure would not be considered conspicuous, and it would probably result in a misleading report. As a reminder, it is not sufficient for the report to merely disclose the use of an extraordinary assumption or hypothetical condition. USPAP requires the report to also state that the use of the extraordinary assumption or hypothetical condition might have affected the assignment results. A brief quiz is up next. End of page. Number 1. An appraiser's assumption that the subject property has clear and marketable title is an example of A. Assumption, B. Title search report, C. Hypothetical condition, or D. Extraordinary condition. I'm going to go A. Assumption. Number 2, what distinguishes an extraordinary assumption from an ordinary assumption? A. An extraordinary assumption is something that is known not to be true. B. An extraordinary assumption is directly related to a specific assignment. C. There is no difference. Or D. An extraordinary assumption is used in virtually all assignments. I'm going to go with B. Number 3. Irving is appraising a proposed new home based on plans and specifications. He is appraising the property as though the new home has been completed as of a current effective date. However, it is actually a vacant lot. This is an example of A. An extraordinary assumption, B. A hypothetical condition, C. A use PAP violation, or D. The jurisdictional exception rule. I'm going to go B. Hypothetical condition. You scored 100%. Continue. Page 11, Standards Rule 2-2. Standards Rule 2-1 gave us some basic direction regarding real property appraisal reports. The specific details of required minimum report content for written reports are found in Standards Rule 2-2. Each written real property appraisal report must be prepared under one of the following options and prominently state which option is used: appraisal report or restricted appraisal report. An appraiser may use any other label in addition to, but not in place of, the labels set forth in this standards rule for the type of report provided. The use of additional labels such as analysis, consultation, evaluation, study, or valuation does not exempt an appraiser from adherence to USPAP. The report content and level of information requirements in this standards rule are minimums for each type of report. An appraiser must supplement a report form when necessary to ensure that an intended user of the appraisal is not misled and that the report complies with the applicable content requirements. 1. The Appraisal Foundation Uniform Standards of Professional Appraisal Practice, Washington, D.C. Appraisal Standards Board 2020 through 2021. Edition, Standard 2, end of page. Page 12. Reporting options in Standards Rule 2-2. To reiterate, Standards Rule 2-2 provides two options for written real property appraisal reports. Number 1, appraisal report. Number 2, restricted appraisal report. Earlier, we discussed the fact that a particular form does not determine what type of report we generate. You will recall that Standard 2 states that the form or format of a report is not dictated by USPAP. Instead, the needs of the client and intended users are the fundamental concerns in selecting the type of report option to be used. Your report will be determined to be an appraisal report or restricted appraisal report based upon the amount of information and level of detail you provide in the report. The course is going to focus on the appraisal report for the primary reason that most of the appraisal reports that we provide are appraisal reports. Typically, our client is not the only intended user of the appraisal report. Therefore, the restricted appraisal report will not be appropriate in most real-life appraisal situations. End of page. Page 13, Appraisal Report. Many appraisal reports that are labeled by appraisers as an appraisal report are not really that at all. Unfortunately, sometimes the appraiser does not provide the minimum content and level of detail required in Standards Rule 2-2 to qualify the report as an appraisal report. A mislabeled appraisal report is misleading. It is possible that the content of the report may meet neither of the reporting options specified by Standards Rule 2-2. Which means the report is not compliant with USPAP. However, careful attention to the reporting requirements found in Standards Rule 2-2 will keep us out of trouble. Standards Rule 2-2 is in two parts, labeled A and B. These parts establish the minimum content requirements for an appraisal report and a restricted appraisal report, respectively. In the next chapter, we are going to concentrate the requirements for completion of an appraisal report. There are 12 numbered content items for each report option. We will continue with the differences between the report options after a short quiz. End of page. Start quiz. Number 1. An appraiser may use another label in place of the report option label required by USPAP Rule Standards 2-2. True or false? I'm not sure. I'm going to go false. Number 2, Nancy is completing an appraisal for a client 2 additional intended users. Which of these is not a permissible option for her when preparing her report? Appraisal report, restricted use appraisal report. I'm going to go restricted use appraisal report. Number 3, what is the essential difference between the 2 reporting options specified in USPAP Standards Rule 2-2? A, the level of detail in the report. B, the amount of analysis required. C, the thickness of the appraisal work file. Or what?
Is it a little warmer?
Yeah.
God, it was freezing, huh?
Or D, the appraisal report has more than 12 required report elements. What is the essential difference between the 2 reporting options specified in USPAP Rule Standards 2? The level of detail. 12 required report elements. I don't know. I'm gonna go D. I'll be down. You scored a 66.7. You needed a 66. Number 1, an appraiser may use another label in place of the report option label required by USPAP Standards Rule 2-2. I said false. You answered correctly. Number 2, Nancy is completing an appraisal for a client and 2 additional intended users. Which of these is not a permissible option for her when preparing her report? I said a restricted use appraisal report. You answered correctly. Number 3, which is the essential difference between the 2 reporting options specified in USPAP Standards Rule 2-2? I said the appraisal report has more than 12 required report elements. That is incorrect. The correct answer is the level of detail in the report. The comment to Standards Rule 2-2 points out that the 2 reporting options are essentially different only in the content and detail contained in the report. Chapter 2, Reporting Options in Standards Rule 2-2. Continue. Page 15, Advisory Opinion 38. Additional helpful information is found in Advisory Opinion 38, which addresses the content of the appraisal report options of Standards Rule 2-2. So we will consider this other communication from the Appraisal Standards Board, ASB, as well. Keep in mind that while the rules, standards, and standards rules of USPAP are enforceable and binding, advisory opinions are not. Although advisory opinions are included with USPAP as a convenience, they are issued to provide advice and guidance by the Appraisal Standards Board and are not considered part of USPAP. However, anytime the ASB gives guidance and advice, appraisers would do well to heed it. The guidance provided in advisory opinions is based on standards and standards rules. So if we choose to ignore the advice of the ASB, it is very possible that we will be tripping over the standards and standards rules in the process. Let's take a look at a table from Advisory Opinion 38, which compares the two reporting options. It can be very cumbersome to flip back and forth between the USPAP pages for Standards Rule 2-2A for the Appraisal Report and Standards Rule 2-2B for the Restricted Appraisal Report. With the information spread out over so many pages, it is difficult to comprehend the differences between these two reporting options. This table gives us each of the reporting options in a side-by-side format. The left column covers the 14 requirements for an appraisal report and quotes all of Standards Rule 2-2A. Except for the comments. The right column gives the 16 requirements for a restricted appraisal report, Standards Rule 2-2B. The table appears on the next page. End of page. The table from Advisory Opinion 38. This is page 16. Look at the table and see if you notice the differences between these two reporting options. The answer can be found on the next page. On the left side is the appraisal report. On the right side is the restricted appraisal report. Under appraisal report, Roman numeral 1, state the identity of the client, or if the client requested anonymity, state that the identity is withheld at the client's request. On the restricted side, Roman numeral 1, state the identity of the client, or if the client requested anonymity, state that the identity is withheld at the client's request. Back on the appraisal report side, Roman numeral 2, state the identity of any other intended users by name or type. On the restricted side, Roman numeral 2, state the identity of any other intended users by name. On the appraisal side, appraisal report side, it says NA, none available. On the restricted side, Roman numeral 3, clearly and conspicuously state a restriction that limits use of the report to the client and the named intended users. On the appraisal side, none available. Back on the restricted side, Roman numeral 4, clearly and conspicuously warn that the report may not contain supporting rationale for all of the opinions and conclusions set forth in the report. On the appraisal side, Roman numeral 3, state the intended use of the appraisal. On the restricted side, Roman numeral 5, state the intended use of the appraisal. And on the appraisal side, Roman numeral 4, contain information, documents, and/or exhibits sufficient to identify the real estate involved in the appraisal, including the physical, legal, and economic property characteristics relevant to the assignment. On the restricted side, Roman numeral 6, state information sufficient to identify the real estate involved in the appraisal. On the appraisal report side, Roman numeral 5, state the real property interests appraised. On the restricted side, Roman numeral 7, state the real property interest appraised. On the appraisal report side, Roman numeral 6, state the type and definition of value and cite the source of the definition. On the restricted side, Roman numeral 8, state the type of value and cite the source of its definition. On the appraisal report side, Roman numeral 7, state the effective date of the appraisal and the date of the report. On the restricted side, Roman numeral 9, state the effective date of the appraisal and the date of the report. On the appraisal report side, Roman numeral 8, summarize the scope of work used to develop the appraisal. On the restricted side, Roman numeral 10, state the scope of work used to develop the appraisal. On the appraisal report side, Roman numeral 9, summarize the extent of any significant real property appraisal assistance. On the restricted side, Roman numeral 11, state the extent of any significant real property appraisal assistance. On the appraisal report side, Roman numeral 10, provide sufficient information to include that the appraiser complied with the requirements of Standard 1 by 1. Summarizing the appraisal methods and techniques employed. 2. Stating the reasons for excluding the sales comparison, cost, or income approaches if any have not been developed. 3. Summarizing the results of analyzing the subject sales, agreements of sale, options, and listings in accordance with the Standards Rule 1-5. And 4. Stating the value, opinions, and conclusions. And 5. Summarizing the information analyzed and reasoning that supports the analysis, opinions, and conclusions, including reconciliation of the data and approaches. On the restricted side, Roman numeral 12, provide sufficient information to indicate that the appraiser complied with requirements of Standard 1 by 1, stating the appraisal methods and techniques employed. 2. Stating the reasons for excluding the sales comparison, cost, or income approaches, if any have not been developed. 3. Summarizing the results of analyzing the subject sales, agreements of sale, options, and listings in accordance with Standards Rule 1-5, and 4. Stating the value, opinions, and conclusions. Comment. An appraiser must maintain a work file that includes sufficient information to indicate that the appraiser complied with the requirements of Standard 1 and for the appraiser to produce an appraisal report. On the appraisal report side, Roman numeral 11, state the use of the real estate existing as of the effective date and the use of the real estate reflected in your appraisal. On the restricted side, Roman numeral 13, state the use of the real estate existing as of the effective date and the use of the real estate reflected in the appraisal. On the appraisal report side, Roman numeral 12, when an opinion of highest and best use was developed by the appraiser, state that opinion and summarize the support and rationale for that opinion. On the restricted side, Roman numeral 14, when an opinion of highest and best use was developed by the appraiser, state that opinion. On the appraisal report side, Roman numeral 13, clearly and conspicuously state all extraordinary assumptions and hypothetical conditions and state that their use might have affected the assignment results. On the restricted side, Roman numeral 15, clearly and conspicuously state all extraordinary assumptions and hypothetical conditions and state that their use might have affected the assignment results. On the appraisal report side, Roman numeral 14, include a signed certification in accordance with Standards Rule 2-3. On the restricted side, Roman numeral 16, include a signed certification in accordance with Standards Rule 2-3. 1. The Appraisal Foundation Uniform Standards of Professional Appraisal Practice, Washington, D.C. Appraisal Standards Board 2020 through 2021, edition, advisory opinion 11.